The moment he stepped onto the plane, everyone in the terminal seemed to forget about their own travel worries. It wasn't that the man was doing anything extraordinary, he was simply walking towards his seat. But there was something about him that made people stop and stare. He was tall, confident, dressed in a sharp suit, and appeared to be the type of person who had control over any situation. Yet, as he made his way down the aisle, there was one thing that was completely out of the ordinary: he was headed straight for economy class. Now, you might be thinking, what's so unusual about someone sitting in the back of the plane? After all, we all have our assigned seats, and economy class is where most of us end up. But in this particular case, this wasn't just any traveler. This man was a pilot. A trained, experienced, and qualified pilot who had flown countless passengers across the globe. He could have chosen a first-class seat, a business-class seat, or even just walked into the cockpit and taken his place among the crew. But he didn't. He was walking to the back of the plane, to a cramped economy seat, just like any other passenger. What happened next? Well, it's something that no one on that flight expected, and the passengers were about to find out the hard way. As the man made his way through the narrow aisle, a flight attendant suddenly stopped him, pointing to his assigned seat, in economy, not first class, not business, but in the cramped rows of the back. It wasn't that there was a shortage of space up front, in fact, the flight was far from full. But still, the stewardess insisted, and the pilot was instructed to sit in his designated seat. That's when things started to get interesting. The passengers, who had been oblivious up until that point, started to murmur, noticing the unusual situation unfolding right before their eyes. Some thought it was just a simple misunderstanding. Others felt a growing unease. Why was this happening? Who was this man, and why was he being treated this way? The tension in the cabin grew thicker by the second. You could almost feel the collective eyes of every passenger on him, waiting for a reaction. And they didn't have to wait long. The man, calm, composed, and professional, paused for a moment. Then, he did something that would change the entire atmosphere of the flight. Without saying a word, he turned around and walked straight toward the front of the plane, his footsteps echoing down the aisle. He moved with purpose, but the flight attendants, who had once been firm with their instructions, were now looking at him with uncertainty. The passengers, confused and intrigued, were glued to their seats. What was he going to do? Was he going to argue? Would there be a confrontation? Everyone was on edge, trying to guess what was going to happen next. But just as the flight attendants began to whisper among themselves, the man stopped. He didn't argue, didn't demand anything. Instead, he smiled and simply said, "I'm the captain." And that one sentence was enough to completely shift the mood of the flight. The air was thick with surprise and confusion. Passengers who had been whispering in disbelief suddenly fell silent. How could this be? The pilot, the man in charge of the entire flight, was being told to sit in the back, away from the cockpit, like just another regular passenger. As the passengers tried to make sense of the situation, the crew quickly began to react. One of the flight attendants turned to speak with the other, but their whispers were too quiet to hear. What were they planning? Why had they asked the pilot to sit in economy? Was there something more to this than what was immediately obvious? The entire plane seemed to hold its breath. What happened next, no one could have predicted. The captain, who had remained silent up until this point, walked toward the cockpit. He was met by another flight attendant, who seemed equally puzzled. But there was something about the way he carried himself that made everyone around him nervous. His calm demeanor, his unwavering confidence, it wasn't like anything they had ever seen before. The flight attendants, who had once been in control of the situation, were now visibly unsure of what to do next. And just when you thought the tension couldn't get any higher, it did. One of the passengers, who had been watching the entire scene unfold, couldn't take it anymore. With a burst of boldness, they stood up from their seat and made their way down the aisle. They had a question. A question that everyone on the plane was asking themselves, but no one had dared to ask out loud: why are you sitting in economy? As the passenger made their way closer to the pilot, the air in the cabin felt thick with anticipation. All eyes were on them. What was going to happen? What would the pilot say? Would he explain himself, or would he remain silent? Would this encounter end in tension, or would something unexpected unfold? But just as the passenger opened their mouth to speak, something happened that none of them could have anticipated. It left everyone on edge and hanging in the balance. What happened next was so unexpected, so unbelievable, that it would leave all the passengers, and you, stunned. And that, my friends, is where we leave you for now. Stay tuned, because the rest of this story is about to get even more unbelievable than you can imagine. What happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about the world of air travel. As the passengers stood up, their eyes locked with the pilot's. The cabin was eerily quiet now, and you could hear the faint hum of the plane's engines in the background. It was the kind of silence that made the simplest exchange feel loaded with meaning. Everyone was waiting. The flight attendants, standing awkwardly by the cockpit door, exchanged glances, as if unsure of whether they should intervene or let this moment unfold. The passenger, clearly perplexed, took another step forward, closer to the man who had just revealed himself as the captain. Their confusion mirrored the feelings of everyone else in the cabin. After all, why on earth would the pilot be sitting in the back, in economy, when his rightful place was up front in the cockpit, where he belonged? But before the passenger could even open their mouth, the captain spoke. His voice was calm, almost too calm, and it carried a weight that caught everyone's attention. "I'm not here to make a scene," he began, his words echoing softly throughout the cabin. "I'm just trying to get to my destination like everyone else." For a brief moment, the passenger stood frozen, unsure of what to say. Was this the man who had control of the flight? The person responsible for everyone's safety? And yet, here he was, sitting where no pilot should be sitting, in the cramped seats at the back of the plane. The pilot continued, sensing the uncertainty in the room. "Look, I know it looks strange, but I assure you, there's a reason for it." A murmur swept through the aisle as more passengers leaned in to hear what he would say next. The atmosphere was now charged with curiosity and tension, as if they were all on the verge of learning something they weren't supposed to know. The stewardess who had initially insisted the pilot sit in economy stood at the back of the plane. Her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and confusion. Her earlier confidence had slipped away. The captain paused for a moment, as if weighing his words. He turned back towards the front of the plane, where the cockpit door was just visible. The flight attendants exchanged glances, and one of them moved to speak, but the captain held up his hand to stop them. "No need to worry," he said, his voice firm but still calm. "The flight is safe. Everything is in order." But that didn't answer the question everyone was dying to know. Why was he sitting in economy? Then, with a slight shift in his posture, the captain seemed to make a decision. He stepped forward, into the aisle, and addressed the entire plane. The quiet was almost suffocating now. Every single passenger had their eyes on him. "You all think this is a simple misunderstanding," he started, his eyes scanning the faces of the passengers. "But it's not." He paused again, letting the words sink in. "Sometimes, things aren't always as they seem." The weight of his statement lingered in the air. What was he talking about? Everyone on board had been wondering why a pilot was sitting in a seat meant for regular passengers, but now it seemed like the situation was far more complicated than they could have imagined. One of the flight attendants, trying to keep her composure, stepped forward. "Excuse me, Captain," she said, her voice shaky but professional, "but you have to return to your seat in the cockpit." She gestured toward the front of the plane, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating tension. The captain, however, didn't flinch. He simply shook his head, as if he had already made up his mind about what he was doing. "I'm afraid that's not possible," he said quietly, a subtle tension in his voice. "The flight isn't going to follow the path you think it is." And just like that, the calm, collected pilot who had appeared so in control began to reveal cracks in his demeanor. There was something in his voice that suggested this was not just about a seating mix-up. No, this was something much bigger, something far more mysterious. Passengers exchanged nervous glances. Some were starting to whisper, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The question on everyone's mind was becoming clearer with each passing second. What did the captain mean when he said the flight wasn't going to follow the path they thought it would? But before anyone could fully process his words, the unexpected happened. The captain turned to the cockpit door, which had remained closed up until now, and made his way toward it. As his hand reached for the handle, the cabin grew even quieter. The flight attendants had no idea what was happening, and they looked at each other with concern. Some passengers even began to murmur to each other, asking if this was all some kind of joke. When the captain reached for the door, something that seemed so normal, something everyone assumed would happen next, didn't. He stopped. His hand hovered above the handle, and the entire plane seemed to freeze in that moment. The seconds stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The door of the cockpit remained locked. No one had expected this. The flight attendants had not prepared for it, and the passengers were still unsure what to make of the situation. Why wasn't he going into the cockpit? A moment later, the captain turned around, his eyes scanning the passengers as if he were searching for something, or perhaps someone. The air was thick with anticipation. The tension on the plane was nearly unbearable. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the captain spoke again, his voice now quieter, more serious. The truth is, he began slowly, pausing for dramatic effect, I'm not the only one with a plan for this flight. The words hit like a wave crashing against the shore. What did that mean? Who else was involved? The captain, the flight attendants, the passengers, all of them were now caught in a web of uncertainty, unsure of who to trust or what was happening next. Just as the passengers' heads were spinning with confusion, the sound of a click echoed throughout the cabin. The cockpit door had been unlocked. But it wasn't the captain who was going in. No, it was someone else entirely. A chill ran down the spine of every passenger on the plane. What had they just stepped into? What was going on behind that cockpit door, and how would it change their journey from here on out? The air was thick with fear, curiosity, and a sense of impending danger. The passengers, the crew, they were all on edge, with no way of knowing how this flight would end. Would they reach their destination safely, or would the plane veer off course in ways they could never imagine? And that, my friends, is where we leave you for now. The rest of this story is far from over. What happens next will keep you on the edge of your seat. Stay tuned. The cockpit door creaked open, and everyone's eyes turned toward it. The passengers had been holding their breath for so long, it felt as though they might all exhale at once. But what they saw next only deepened the mystery. It wasn't the captain stepping through the door, nor was it anyone who looked like a regular crew member. It was someone who seemed completely out of place. A man in a dark hoodie, his face partially obscured by sunglasses, stepped into the cockpit. The door shut behind him with a soft thud. The flight attendants froze. Their hands hovered awkwardly above their service carts, unsure of what to do next. They had never been trained for a situation like this. Was this part of the protocol? Was it a security breach? No one had the answers, and the tension in the cabin only grew thicker. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, murmuring quietly among themselves. Some tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Was it a misunderstanding? Was this man just a fellow crew member who was taking over for the pilot? But deep down, they knew that couldn't be right. Something was off. The captain had said something earlier that still echoed in their minds. The flight isn't going to follow the path you think it is. Those words kept spinning around in the passengers' heads. What did he mean by that? Was the flight in danger? Was there a hidden agenda at play? No one could be sure, but the uncertainty was unbearable. And then, as if to heighten the suspense even further, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom, breaking the silence that had settled over the plane. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I regret to inform you that there has been a change in the crew assignment for this flight. For your safety, the situation is being handled by a team with more experience in this particular situation. Please remain seated and stay calm. I'll be with you shortly. The calmness in his voice was unsettling. How could he sound so collected while everything was so clearly wrong? The crew members exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes darting back and forth between the cockpit door and the increasingly uneasy passengers. The flight attendants began moving more quickly, walking down the aisles, checking on the passengers, offering reassuring smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. One of the passengers, a man in his 30s with a nervous energy about him, had been observing the situation from the very beginning. His instincts were sharp, and the tension in the air had set off alarm bells in his mind. He had tried to ignore it at first, assuming it was just a simple mix-up. But now, watching the strange figure in the cockpit and hearing the captain's calm but cryptic message, he could no longer sit back and pretend everything was fine. He stood up, making his way toward the back of the plane, careful not to draw too much attention to himself. He didn't want to cause a panic, but he needed to find out more. He approached one of the flight attendants, a young woman who looked equally confused and out of place. Her eyes flickered nervously as he drew near, and he could sense her unease. "Excuse me," he said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's going on? Who was that man who just went into the cockpit?" The flight attendant hesitated before answering. She glanced around, making sure no one else was listening, and then lowered her voice to a whisper. "I don't know. He wasn't one of the regular crew members. I don't even know if he's supposed to be here." Her voice trembled slightly. "I don't think we're being told everything." Her words sent a chill through the man's spine. It wasn't just that something felt off, it was that the people in charge were acting like they were in the dark too. That made everything even more dangerous. The man nodded, thanked the flight attendant, and moved away, trying to calm his racing thoughts. What was happening? Who were these people? Why wasn't anyone being honest with the passengers? As he returned to his seat, the murmur of conversations in the cabin grew louder. The passengers were starting to notice that something wasn't right. Some were trying to distract themselves by scrolling through their phones or flipping through magazines, but the nervous energy was palpable. Others were frantically looking for information on the in-flight entertainment system, but it was offline. There was no news, no updates, only the growing sense that they were all in the dark. The man sat back down, his eyes scanning the aisle. A woman seated next to him, who had been quietly watching the scene unfold, leaned over. "Do you think something's wrong?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He met her gaze, hesitated for a moment, and then nodded. "I don't know, but I have a feeling we're not getting the full story." She looked uneasy, her fingers gripping the armrest. "I heard something earlier. I overheard the flight attendants talking. They're all worried, too. This isn't just a minor mistake." Before he could respond, the captain's voice came through the intercom again, but this time it was different. There was a slight tremor in his tone that hadn't been there before, as though he was struggling to maintain control. "Attention, everyone," he began, his voice sounding slightly strained. "I need you all to remain calm. We're making an unscheduled detour. I repeat, an unscheduled detour. Please stay in your seats with your seat belts fastened. I will update you when we're able to do so." The announcement sent a ripple of panic through the cabin. Unscheduled detour? What did that mean? Were they being rerouted for some reason? The man sitting by the window turned pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrest. Other passengers began whispering among themselves, wondering what was happening. Some tried to look out the windows, but the clouds outside were thick, obscuring any view of the ground. The uncertainty was suffocating. As the minutes dragged on, the unease in the cabin grew. The captain's announcement had only deepened the mystery. Why was the flight being redirected? And who were these people making the decisions? The man who had overheard the flight attendants spoke up again, his voice low but urgent. "Something's going on up there. This doesn't feel like a routine delay. This feels planned." The woman beside him nodded in agreement. "Do you think we're in danger?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the cockpit, where the strange figure in the hoodie had been seated moments ago. What was going on in that cockpit? Who were these people, and what did they want with this flight? As the plane continued its course through the thick clouds, the mystery deepened. Passengers were now whispering in hushed tones, their minds racing with the possibilities. Was this just a mix-up? A strange series of events? Or was something far more sinister at play? The tension was unbearable. And as the minutes ticked by, one thing became clear: the flight was no longer just about reaching its destination. It was about survival. The quiet murmurs of passengers grew louder with each passing minute, their confusion and fear slowly transforming into anxiety. The cabin was thick with uncertainty, and the flight attendants, still trying to keep a calm appearance, were moving more swiftly now, offering reassurances that none of them seemed to truly believe. The silence of the cockpit behind them was unnerving, and as the minutes ticked by without any new information, the discomfort in the air became almost unbearable. The man who had overheard the flight attendants was sitting tense in his seat, his hands clutching the armrest. His mind raced, replaying every moment since the strange man in the hoodie entered the cockpit. What was going on? Who was he? Why had the captain allowed someone else to take over, and why weren't they telling the passengers the truth? The man's instincts told him this wasn't just an ordinary flight delay, and the vague announcements from the captain did nothing to ease his suspicions. His eyes kept darting toward the cockpit door, but it remained closed, a barrier between the unknown and the uneasy passengers. He could feel the collective weight of everyone's gaze in the cabin, each person now fully aware that something was wrong. The unease in the air was palpable. Some passengers whispered nervously about what could be happening, others tried to ignore it by pretending to read or talk on their phones. But deep down, they all felt it, the tension that had taken over the plane. He glanced at the woman beside him again, noticing that her face had gone pale. She was clearly trying to hold it together, but the fear was evident in her eyes. "What do you think they're doing in there?" she asked quietly, voice shaking just slightly. The man didn't respond right away. What could he say? He didn't have any answers. But he knew one thing for sure: things weren't right. Something wasn't adding up, and the cryptic messages from the captain only seemed to fuel the growing sense of dread. The detour wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was part of a plan. But whose plan? And why? The plane seemed to have settled into an eerie stillness, with only the hum of the engines breaking the silence. A few passengers continued to glance toward the cockpit, eyes wide with confusion and worry. The flight attendants had gathered near the rear of the cabin, huddled in an almost secretive manner. They exchanged low whispers, their faces flushed with what seemed to be a mix of concern and fear. One of the flight attendants, a young man who had previously seemed calm, looked out at the passengers, his eyes betraying his own anxiety. He caught the man's gaze, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. The man could sense the tension in the flight attendant's gaze. There was something he wanted to say, something more than just empty reassurances, but he didn't. Instead, he simply looked away and walked toward the back of the plane. That one moment of unspoken communication was enough to fuel the man's growing suspicion. The flight attendants knew more than they were letting on. And whatever was going on in the cockpit, it was something they couldn't control. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Every passenger on the plane was now wondering if they were safe. If this was a hijacking, a diversion, or something else entirely, no one could say. The possibilities seemed endless, but none of them were reassuring. As the man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze fell to the window. The clouds outside had thickened further, now a solid wall of gray. The usual comfort of being high above the world seemed far away. There was no way of knowing where they were heading, and that lack of control made the whole situation that much more terrifying. Then, unexpectedly, the captain's voice came through the intercom again, this time with a tone that was much more urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain once more," he said, his voice strained. "Please be advised that we are experiencing some technical difficulties. Our course is being adjusted due to unforeseen circumstances. Please remain calm, stay in your seats, and do not attempt to leave the cabin. We'll update you shortly. Thank you for your understanding." The man could feel the tension ripple through the cabin. Technical difficulties? It didn't make sense. If there were issues with the plane, why weren't they being more specific? Why weren't they informing passengers about what was really happening? The announcement only deepened the mystery, and the unease in the cabin was becoming unbearable. The woman beside him squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the uncertainty, but the fear was now too overwhelming. Everyone around them seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Passengers were clutching their seatbelts, and the quiet chatter that had filled the air moments ago had died down, replaced by a hushed tension that could almost be felt physically. And then, as though on cue, the lights in the cabin flickered briefly, casting a dim, unsettling glow across the rows. For a brief moment, everything seemed to stand still. The flicker of the lights only added to the sense of unease that had settled over the plane. The passengers were now looking around at each other, exchanging silent glances, each wondering if the other had any answers. The situation was escalating, and no one knew how it would end. At the back of the plane, one of the flight attendants stepped forward, visibly shaken. "Please," she began, her voice strained, "just stay calm. Everything will be okay." But her words rang hollow. Her face had lost its usual composure, and it was clear she didn't believe what she was saying. The man in his seat shifted again, unable to sit still any longer. The questions that had been swirling in his mind were now growing louder. Why hadn't the captain been more specific? Why had they been told about technical difficulties instead of being told the truth? And most importantly, why hadn't they been told exactly what was happening in the cockpit? He wanted to go up there. He wanted to demand answers. But something inside him told him that even if he did, he wouldn't get the truth. The whole situation was unraveling, and the more he thought about it, the more it felt like they were all pawns in a game they didn't understand. Just as the tension reached its peak, a sudden sound broke through the stillness. It was the unmistakable noise of the overhead compartments shifting, something moving in the ceiling. The man's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. What was that? Was there something wrong with the plane? Or was it something else? Everyone in the cabin turned toward the source of the noise. The flight attendants quickly moved to the rear of the plane, but it was too late. The sound had stopped. And with it, a new kind of fear spread through the passengers. Now, more than ever, the question remained, what was really going on, and, more urgently, where was this flight headed? The noise from the overhead compartment was brief, but it had caused a ripple of panic that spread like wildfire. The flight attendants, who had been doing their best to keep calm, now moved with an urgency that was impossible to ignore. Their eyes darted from the cabin to the cockpit door, then back again, as if they were trying to figure out how to handle a situation they were clearly unprepared for. The man who had been listening to the flight attendants' whispered conversation earlier could see it in their eyes. They knew something more than they were telling. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface was now seeping through the cracks, and it was impossible to deny. He wasn't the only one who had noticed the change in atmosphere. All around him, people were tense, holding their breath, waiting for the next announcement, the next clue, the next anything that might give them a sense of control. In the back of the plane, the woman who had spoken to him earlier turned toward him again, her face pale, her hands shaking as they rested in her lap. "What if this isn't just a diversion?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What if something worse is happening?" Her words hung in the air like an unspoken truth. What if they weren't just being rerouted? What if this wasn't a simple miscommunication or technical issue? The man thought back to the captain's strange statement, "This flight isn't going to follow the path you think it is." What did that mean? And more importantly, why wasn't anyone telling them what was really going on? The captain had said there was an unscheduled detour, but detours didn't normally make passengers feel this way. Detours didn't cause the flight attendants to look over their shoulders with nervous glances. Detours didn't make people question everything around them. And yet, here they were, in the middle of an unscheduled detour, with no clear answers. As the woman beside him looked out of the window, her gaze scanning the cloudy sky as if searching for something, anything, that might offer reassurance, the man's thoughts wandered to the strange figure who had entered the cockpit earlier. What was his role? Why had the captain allowed him to take over? The flight attendants were acting like they had no idea who he was, but the man felt something in his gut telling him they were hiding something. There was a connection between the captain, the mysterious figure, and the strange series of events that had unfolded on this flight. But what was it? His mind raced with possibilities. Was there some kind of hijacking happening? Had the crew been compromised? The captain's calm demeanor, while reassuring to some, felt like a carefully constructed mask, hiding something much darker beneath the surface. If this was all part of a well-orchestrated plan, what was the endgame? The unease in the cabin was now palpable. People were whispering to each other, exchanging theories, but there were no answers. Every attempt to understand the situation only seemed to lead to more questions. The man felt the weight of his own growing frustration. He couldn't just sit back and wait for the next announcement. There had to be something he could do. He rose from his seat, trying not to attract attention, and began to make his way down the aisle. The flight attendants barely acknowledged him, too absorbed in their own tense conversations. He moved toward the front of the plane, inching closer to the cockpit door, hoping to get some sense of what was going on. As he walked, he noticed the flight attendants trying to maintain a facade of normalcy, but their anxious glances toward the cockpit betrayed their nerves. He reached the small galley near the cockpit, the space where the flight attendants usually made their rounds. One of them, a woman with blonde hair tied back in a tight ponytail, was standing by the counter, her hands clutching the edge as if to steady herself. When she saw him approaching, her eyes widened, and she quickly straightened her posture, attempting to regain control of her emotions. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice low but insistent. "What's really happening?" She hesitated, her eyes darting to the cockpit door, then back to him. I don't know," she whispered, barely audible. "The captain said everything was fine, but I don't believe him. Something isn't right." Her voice broke as she spoke, and for the first time since the flight began, the man saw genuine fear in her eyes. A cold shiver ran down his spine. If the flight attendants were scared, what did that say about the situation? How far did this go? What was really happening behind that locked door? Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life again, and the captain's voice, calm as always, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened. We are approaching a location where we will be conducting a controlled maneuver. Please stay calm and do not panic. We'll update you shortly." A controlled maneuver? The words hung in the air, heavy with ambiguity. What kind of maneuver required this much secrecy? What was going on? The man looked around the cabin. Passengers were looking at each other with growing concern. Some of them clutched their seatbelts tighter, while others simply stared at the seat backs in front of them, as if avoiding making eye contact with anyone else. The tension in the air had reached a boiling point. At that moment, a man seated near the back stood up suddenly. His face was pale, his eyes wild. He began to shout toward the cockpit, his voice cracking with panic. "What's going on? Why are we being diverted? What is happening to this plane?" A few passengers looked toward him, but no one moved. The flight attendants were slow to react, their faces tense and uncertain. The shouting man's words seemed to hang in the air, unchallenged. It was as if everyone on board was waiting for someone, anyone, to make sense of this madness. The shouting man's panic was contagious, and the cabin filled with murmurs again. The air grew thick with uncertainty, as if everyone had suddenly realized they were all on the edge of something they didn't understand and couldn't control. Was it a hijacking? Were they going to crash? What was the real reason for the detour? The questions were endless, and the answers were nowhere to be found. The man who had been quietly observing everything from the beginning felt his pulse quicken. His gaze shifted toward the cockpit once more. There was something hidden behind that door, something that everyone on this plane was being kept in the dark about. The strange figure, the captain's cryptic messages, the unexplainable detour, all of it was adding up to something bigger. But what? As the man looked down the aisle, his heart raced. He could feel the weight of the situation settling in. The uncertainty had become unbearable, and the flight's destination, whatever it was, remained shrouded in mystery. No one knew where they were headed, but the fear was growing. The passengers could feel it. The tension was undeniable. And yet, the most chilling thought of all was the one that kept looping in his mind. They might never know the truth until it was too late. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. The murmurs from the passengers grew louder, and the occasional cry of frustration or confusion pierced through the low hum of the plane's engines. But despite the growing unease, no one moved. Everyone remained in their seats, eyes flicking from the cockpit door to the flight attendants, desperately searching for an answer that wasn't coming. It was as if they were all trapped in a limbo, unsure of what was happening but certain that it wasn't good. The man who had been observing everything felt an increasing sense of urgency. He had never been one to sit idly by when something was wrong, and everything about this situation screamed that something was terribly wrong. He was on the verge of getting up again, of heading toward the cockpit to demand some kind of explanation, when a sudden movement caught his eye. One of the flight attendants, the same one who had seemed so shaken earlier, hurried toward the back of the plane, her face pale and drawn. She was carrying something, a small, unmarked bag. As she passed by the man, she briefly made eye contact, her expression pained. She didn't say a word, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. Whatever was happening on this flight, it was far more serious than any of them had imagined. The man's stomach twisted. That bag wasn't just some piece of ordinary luggage, it was out of place, and it seemed like it had just come from the cockpit. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that bag was somehow connected to the chaos unfolding around them. He knew he couldn't let this go. He had to know what was happening. With every ounce of his willpower, he stayed in his seat for just a moment longer, trying to piece things together. But the mystery only deepened with every passing second. He glanced at the woman beside him again. Her eyes were wide now, scanning the cabin as if she were looking for an escape. It was clear that the fear had taken root in her mind, and she wasn't the only one. The entire cabin seemed to be holding its collective breath, waiting for something to break the silence. Suddenly, the plane jolted, and the man's grip tightened on the armrest. A gasp ran through the passengers. Some of them glanced nervously at the windows as if expecting the worst. But there was no change in the view outside. The clouds still loomed, dark and oppressive. The plane continued its slow, unnerving course. Then the intercom crackled again, this time with a voice that wasn't the captain's. It was a man's voice, one that none of the passengers recognized. His words were sharp, his tone cold. "Attention, passengers. Please remain calm and do not panic. We have made the necessary adjustments, and the plane is safe. You are being diverted for your own protection. There is no immediate danger, but we advise you to remain in your seats. There will be no further announcements at this time." The voice cut off abruptly, and for a moment, there was complete silence in the cabin. Everyone was left in stunned disbelief, trying to make sense of what had just been said. No immediate danger? What did that even mean? Protection from what? And why hadn't the captain spoken? Why had they been handed off to someone else, someone they didn't know or trust? The confusion in the cabin reached a boiling point. Some passengers started to murmur nervously again, while others, like the man, simply sat in stunned silence, trying to digest the message. The woman beside him turned toward him with wide, fearful eyes. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. What does that mean?" He didn't have an answer for her, and honestly, he didn't know if he even had an answer for himself. The pieces weren't fitting together, and every moment that passed seemed to add more layers to the mystery. The more the man tried to understand, the less sense everything made. The presence of the mysterious figure in the cockpit, the unexplained detour, the cryptic announcements, it all felt like a carefully woven web that he couldn't quite untangle. He leaned back in his seat, trying to steady his breath. The sound of the engines whirring seemed oddly comforting for a moment, like a lifeline in the middle of the storm. But it didn't last long. A chill crept up his spine as he realized something. The flight attendants hadn't made another move. They had stopped checking on the passengers, stopped trying to maintain the illusion of calm. They were stationed at the rear of the plane, speaking in hushed voices. But the tension in their faces was unmistakable. The blonde-haired flight attendant, the one who had seemed most on edge, was now staring out the small rear window, her body stiff, her eyes scanning the distance as if she were waiting for something. Waiting for what? The man's eyes narrowed as he tried to make sense of it. Could it be that the flight attendants knew something the passengers didn't? Could they be in on whatever was happening behind the scenes? Before he could dwell on it too long, he heard a rustle behind him. He turned, startled, to find the man who had shouted earlier standing in the aisle again. His eyes were wide, his hands trembling as he gripped the back of the seat in front of him. He was breathing heavily, his voice breaking as he looked around at the passengers. "This isn't right," the man muttered, almost to himself. "None of this is right." The flight attendants moved toward him quickly, but the man didn't seem to notice. "Why aren't they telling us what's happening?" he demanded. "Why is the captain not coming out? Why don't they?" Before he could finish, another flight attendant stepped in, gently but firmly placing a hand on his shoulder. "Please, sir, just sit down," she said softly, trying to calm him. "Everything's fine. Please remain in your seat." But the man wasn't listening. His eyes were darting around the cabin, as though searching for someone to offer an explanation, someone who could give him the answers he so desperately needed. But no one had any answers. Not the flight attendants, not the captain, not the mysterious figure who had come into the cockpit. Everyone was as much in the dark as he was. The man, growing more agitated by the second, turned toward the cockpit door. "I want answers," he shouted. "I want to know what's going on." The flight attendants were quick to move, their voices rising in a desperate attempt to defuse the situation. But no one was listening. The cabin was in chaos now, passengers standing, shouting questions, demanding answers. Everyone was on edge, and the tension in the air was suffocating. And still, the cockpit door remained closed. No one knew what was happening inside, and no one knew where they were headed next. The man could feel it, the growing sense of danger, of impending crisis. But what was the nature of that danger? What lay ahead? As the plane continued its eerie, unpredictable flight, the only thing that was certain was this: whatever was happening, it was only just beginning. The chaos in the cabin escalated rapidly. It was as though the air had thickened with fear, and no one knew where to turn. The man, who had been trying to make sense of everything, felt his heart racing as he watched passengers scrambling for answers, desperately searching for some kind of assurance. But there were no answers to be found, and the more they demanded, the more it seemed like the truth was slipping further out of their grasp. The flight attendants, who had been trained to keep calm in the face of emergencies, were now visibly shaken. They huddled in small groups at the back of the plane, speaking in hushed tones. The blonde-haired flight attendant was wringing her hands, her eyes wide with an anxiety that was hard to mask. They were trying their best to maintain control, but it was clear that something far beyond their training was happening. The man had seen enough. He couldn't sit idly by any longer. The fact that the cockpit door had remained closed all this time was enough to convince him that whatever was happening, it was being kept hidden for a reason. The flight attendant's behavior, the captain's cryptic messages, the mysterious figure in the cockpit, everything pointed to one inescapable conclusion. There was something they weren't telling the passengers. Something dangerous, something life-threatening. But what? He glanced back at the woman sitting beside him. She was holding her phone now, scrolling frantically through something on the screen, her face pale as she whispered to herself, almost as if she were trying to convince herself that this wasn't real. I can't believe this is happening," she muttered under her breath. "This isn't happening. This isn't real." But it was real. Too real. The plane had already veered off course, and the unnerving hum of the engines seemed to grow louder, as if the plane itself was gearing up for something. The air pressure shifted again, and the passengers could feel it, a subtle change that only deepened the unease in the cabin. The man looked at his watch. The minutes seemed to drag on forever, but no announcement came. No updates. Nothing. The shouting man from earlier had settled back into his seat, but it was clear he wasn't calming down. His breathing was erratic now, his hands shaking as they rested on his knees. He was terrified, and everyone around him could feel it. His panic had become contagious, and the tension in the cabin was palpable. Every single person was on edge, eyes darting from the cockpit to the flight attendants, from the windows to the overhead compartments. There was nowhere safe to look, nowhere to hide from the growing fear. The man's eyes flicked back to the cockpit door, still locked tight. He couldn't explain why, but it felt as though something was alive back there, something that was beyond anyone's control. And the longer they stayed in this unknown space, the more he began to feel the suffocating weight of isolation. He wasn't just in an airplane anymore. He was in a waiting room. Waiting for something to happen. Waiting for something terrible. Without thinking, he stood up and began making his way toward the front of the plane again. His legs felt like lead, but his determination pushed him forward. Every step seemed to echo louder than the last, and it felt like the whole plane was holding its breath. He reached the small galley area where the flight attendants had been, but it was empty now. The blonde-haired attendant was gone, and the others had disappeared into the forward cabin. They were all in hiding, or maybe they were just waiting for someone else to take charge. But the man wasn't waiting anymore. He moved quickly, almost recklessly, toward the cockpit. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, a pounding rhythm that matched the heavy footsteps of the others. They weren't shouting anymore. The silence in the cabin had taken on a suffocating quality. The voices that had once filled the space were now gone, replaced with the low hum of the engines and the occasional rustle of a seatbelt or the crinkle of an air vent. When he reached the cockpit door, he stopped. He wasn't sure what to do next. But there was no turning back now. He had come this far. His hand hovered over the handle, his fingers shaking. There was a small window in the door, and through it, he could see nothing but darkness. No one was in there. It was as if the cockpit had been abandoned entirely. His hand found the handle. It turned. The door creaked open. What he saw inside made his stomach lurch. The cockpit was empty. No one was there. Not the captain. Not the mysterious figure who had come into the cockpit earlier. Nothing. The man stood frozen in the doorway for a moment, the silence almost deafening. His mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. The cockpit was immaculate, the instruments glowing softly in the dim light. But there was no sign of life. No sign of anyone who was supposed to be in control of this plane. He stepped into the cockpit, his breath shallow, his heart hammering in his chest. It was as if he had stumbled into a strange, eerie void. He ran his hand along the controls, trying to make sense of it all, but there was no explanation. Nothing to suggest where the captain had gone, or why they had been left alone. The controls were all functional, but the plane was still moving, still on its strange course. He turned quickly, his pulse racing, and hurried back toward the cabin. He needed to tell someone. But who could he trust now? The flight attendants were nowhere to be found, and the passengers were growing more restless by the minute. His thoughts were scrambled as he made his way back to his seat, but a strange sense of urgency filled him. Something had changed. Something had shifted. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The plane wasn't just lost. It wasn't just diverted. It was heading somewhere, and wherever it was waiting for them. As he sat down, the plane jolted again, more violently this time, throwing him forward in his seat. The overhead compartments rattled, and several people screamed in panic. His grip tightened on the armrest as he glanced toward the windows, trying to see anything, anything, that could tell him where they were, what was happening. But all he saw was the endless expanse of clouds. The intercom crackled again, but this time, the voice that came through wasn't the captain's, nor was it the same voice from earlier. It was distorted, garbled, as if the speaker had been damaged. Prepare for impact. The words hung in the air for a moment, chilling the passengers to their bones. No one moved. No one spoke. But the fear was undeniable, and the clock was ticking down to something inevitable. The man's eyes went wide. He stood, the words echoing in his mind. For impact, the plane continued its descent, but where it was heading, no one knew. The announcement hung in the air, its implications sinking into every passenger's chest like a heavy weight. Prepare for impact. Those words reverberated through the cabin, as if the very air had thickened with dread. For a brief moment, there was no movement. Just stunned silence. Then, like the snap of a string pulled too tight, panic set in. Around the cabin, people started to react. Some were clutching their armrests, eyes wide and glued to the windows, trying to see through the layers of clouds, searching for anything that would give them a clue about their fate. Others were muttering prayers, fingers trembling over their loved ones' hands. The woman beside the man had turned pale, her breath shallow, her eyes darting from the windows to him, searching for reassurance, but he had none to offer. His heart was pounding in his chest as he quickly turned to the aisle. His mind raced with the desperation of someone whose survival depended on understanding what was happening. Every part of him screamed for answers. The flight attendants were nowhere to be seen, and the passengers, now fully aware that something was catastrophically wrong, began murmuring to each other in hushed voices. The flight was no longer just a strange diversion. The very air around them felt ominous, like the calm before a storm. He could feel the tension building with each passing second, and though the plane continued to fly, it didn't feel like it was moving through the sky in a controlled manner. Every time the engine shifted, there was a sharp jolt, a sudden dip, or a frightening lurch that seemed to promise something was amiss. His grip on the armrest tightened. He had to do something. But what? The cockpit was empty, the captain nowhere to be found, and the passengers were beginning to lose control. The woman beside him started to breathe faster, her chest rising and falling with increasing panic. "Hey," he whispered to her, trying to keep his voice steady, even though his heart felt like it was about to explode in his chest. "We'll be okay." She looked at him, but her eyes were wide with terror. "How do you know that?" "They just said." Her voice broke off as another violent jolt shook the plane. The lights flickered for a moment, casting eerie shadows across the cabin. A few people screamed. "Stay calm," he urged, though his own composure was slipping. He had no idea what to do, but he couldn't let everyone else around him fall apart. Panic was contagious. It was already spreading. The murmurs from the passengers became louder, more insistent. Whispers of conspiracy. Theories about the plane's trajectory. Some passengers swore they had heard someone say the plane was being hijacked. Others began talking about the strange behavior of the crew. Whatever the cause, no one seemed to have any answers, and the fear was beginning to reach its boiling point. The man looked up at the cabin ahead of him. The flight attendants had returned, but they weren't walking the aisles as they should have been. They were huddled together in the rear of the plane, talking in low voices, their faces pale and tight with worry. They didn't seem like the calm, professional attendants they had been at the start of the flight. No, something had changed in them, too. They were just as scared as the passengers. Suddenly, the intercom crackled again, and this time, the voice was more distorted, more chilling than before. It was faint, but enough to send a shiver down everyone's spine. "Tens, tie, on, east, impact." The sentence was incomprehensible, leaving only fragments of words hanging in the air like pieces of a broken puzzle. The final word, impact, seemed to hang in the air long after the transmission had ended. The lack of clarity was maddening. What did it mean? Was the flight about to crash? Were they headed toward an uncharted destination, or was there something else entirely at play? The man's breath came faster now, his thoughts racing. He couldn't keep waiting for answers. He had to act, or else he might lose his chance. The woman beside him was now visibly trembling, her hands clutching the armrest so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. He could see the panic in her eyes, and it made his own anxiety spike. He glanced at the aisle again, and this time, he saw movement, one of the flight attendants, her face grim and strained, moving toward the cockpit. It wasn't normal. They were supposed to be helping the passengers, maintaining order in the cabin. Why was she heading toward the cockpit? Something wasn't right. He stood abruptly, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him as the plane jolted again. This time, it felt more forceful, as though the plane was lurching downward. There was a collective gasp from the passengers, and the cabin was filled with an air of sheer panic. The man pushed through the aisles toward the back of the plane, ignoring the protests of the other passengers. He needed to know what was going on. He had to get to the cockpit, or at least find someone who could explain what was happening. As he reached the rear of the plane, he spotted the flight attendant who had been heading toward the cockpit. She was just about to disappear into the small galley, but he caught her arm. "Wait," he said urgently. "Where are you going? What's happening? What did that last message mean?" The woman's eyes met his, and for the briefest moment, something in her gaze flickered, fear, yes, but also something darker. She opened her mouth to speak, but then the overhead lights flickered again, the familiar hum of the engines growing louder. It was almost as if the plane were responding to something deep inside of it that had shifted. The woman swallowed, looking over her shoulder as though she were afraid someone might be listening. "We don't have much time," she whispered, pulling him toward the galley. "You need to stay calm, but you need to know the truth." The man felt a chill creep over him, the urgency of the moment sinking deeper. He had to know, but what was she about to say? His heart hammered in his chest as she continued. "The cockpit," she paused, looking over her shoulder once more. "There's no one in there. The captain, he's gone. We don't know what happened. But there's something wrong with this plane. It's not just a diversion. We're heading into danger. And we might not make it out of this." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He wanted to demand more. He wanted answers, but she was already walking away, disappearing into the shadows of the galley, leaving him standing there in stunned silence. The plane jolted again, more violently this time, throwing him off balance. The intercom crackled to life again, this time louder than before. "We are descending rapidly. Prepare for..." The transmission was abruptly cut off, leaving the final message hanging in the air, unfinished. The lights flickered one last time, and everything plunged into darkness. The plane plummeted. There was no denying it now. The descent had begun. The man grabbed onto the nearest seat, his pulse racing. The fear in the cabin was palpable. Everyone was now bracing for the inevitable, their faces reflecting the shared terror. The woman beside him clutched his hand tightly, her voice a frantic whisper. "It's happening," she breathed. "What do we do?" He didn't have an answer. All he knew was that whatever was coming, it was coming fast. And there was no way of knowing what would happen when they hit the ground. The moment of truth was about to arrive, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would be the same again. The plane's descent was rapid now, faster than anyone could have imagined. The screams from the passengers filled the cabin, a cacophony of terror and disbelief. Every jerk of the aircraft felt like a stab to the heart, a gut-wrenching reminder that they were spiraling towards something they couldn't control. The lights flickered one final time, and then everything went pitch black. For a few seconds, it felt as though time had stopped. There was only the oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of frantic breathing and the occasional rattle of overhead compartments. The air was thick with fear. No one knew what was happening, and the unknown was more terrifying than anything else. But then, in the darkened cabin, something happened that would change everything. A loud, jarring crash echoed through the plane, an explosion of sound that seemed to reverberate in every corner of the cabin. The force of it was enough to send people flying from their seats. A massive, blinding light flared from the front of the plane, illuminating the walls in sickly shades of red and orange. The man, who had been gripping the armrest with white-knuckled intensity, felt the impact with his entire body. The plane lurched again, this time in a way that suggested they were no longer in freefall, but perhaps skimming the ground. He couldn't even process the information quickly enough to make sense of it. And then the intercom crackled to life once more, but this time, it wasn't a voice they recognized. It was a harsh, garbled sound, distorted beyond comprehension. Yet, within the static, there was a clear and terrifying message. "Don't move, stay hidden." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving behind a trail of confusion and fear. No one knew who was speaking, but the urgency in the words was enough to make the hair on the back of the man's neck stand up. It wasn't just an announcement, it was a warning. Stay hidden. But hidden from what? From who? The woman beside him had gone completely still, her hands still clutching his, but now trembling uncontrollably. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. She had heard it too. They all had. And now, no one knew what to do with the chilling command to remain hidden. It felt as if they were being told to prepare for something far worse than the crash that seemed imminent. Something more sinister. The man's mind raced as he tried to piece it all together. The strange behavior of the flight crew, the unexplainable descent, the cryptic messages over the intercom, and now this. The plane had been diverted, and now it was falling from the sky with increasing speed, but the warning, it changed everything. Who was coming? What did they mean by stay hidden? He glanced around at the other passengers, some of whom were clutching their loved ones, others still trying to figure out what was happening. The fear was palpable in the cabin, thick and suffocating, but in the midst of it all, he noticed something that caught his attention. A figure moving quickly through the aisles, almost too quickly for anyone to notice, a flight attendant. But not one of the attendants they had seen before. No, this one had a look about her that was almost off. Her movements were erratic, as if she were trying to stay unnoticed, but her eyes were darting nervously around, as if she were searching for something, or someone. The man stood up, his heart racing as he tried to follow her through the chaos of the cabin. What was she doing? Why was she moving like that? Something about her was wrong, and it sent a ripple of unease through him. He didn't have time to think about it, he had to act. He pushed through the crowd, trying to reach her before she disappeared, but the turbulence was making it nearly impossible to keep his footing. People were panicking, screaming, and crying, and he was just one person trying to make sense of it all. Finally, he spotted her at the back of the plane, near the galley. She was standing still now, her face hidden in the shadows. But as he got closer, he saw it. She wasn't alone. Another figure, this one tall and imposing, stood behind her. His features were indistinguishable, obscured by the dim light and the frantic movement around them, but the man could tell immediately that something wasn't right. The figure's body language was too stiff, too deliberate, and the way he was standing close to the flight attendant sent a chill through the man. Suddenly, the flight attendant turned toward him, her eyes wide, and she mouthed something he couldn't hear over the noise of the cabin. But the urgency in her expression was clear, she was trying to warn him. Before he could approach, she quickly turned back toward the figure, her body blocking him from view. The man's pulse quickened. Whatever was going on, whatever they were planning, it had just become even more dangerous. He was about to take another step forward when the entire plane lurched again, this time with such force that he was thrown backward into his seat. A violent shaking filled the cabin, and the sound of the engines was deafening as the plane dipped sharply downward. Everyone screamed. The man's breath caught in his throat as the cabin buckled under the pressure. Was this it? Was the plane about to crash? The lights flickered back on, casting a cold, unnatural glow on the faces of the passengers. But the eerie silence that followed was broken only by the strange humming sound that now filled the air, something deep and resonating, like the hum of a machine, but amplified and wrong. It was unnerving, the kind of sound that seemed to come from deep within the plane itself. And then it happened. A voice, this time unmistakable, came over the intercom, but it wasn't the captain, nor any other crew member. It wasn't even human. The voice was cold, mechanical, almost robotic. But it was clear enough for everyone to hear. Asterisk, we have arrived, asterisk, the words echoed through the cabin, and for a split second, it felt as if the entire plane had stopped moving. The words were chilling, final. The message had the weight of inevitability. They weren't just descending anymore. They had arrived at wherever they were going. But where? The man's mind raced as he looked out the window, searching for any sign of where they were. But the sky was now dark, darker than it had been before, and in the distance, he thought he saw strange lights, flickering, irregular, as though they were in an unfamiliar, isolated place. Stay hidden, the voice had said. But hidden from what? He glanced back at the woman beside him, who was shaking her head in disbelief, her mouth moving but no words coming out. The plane wasn't just descending toward Earth. It was landing in something else, something not of this world. The engines sputtered once more, and the humming intensified. The man couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into something they couldn't understand. And whatever it was only going to get worse. They weren't just passengers anymore. They were being trapped. The plane was no longer just an aircraft, it had become part of something much bigger, something far more terrifying than they had ever imagined. The man's heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the woman's hand, pulling her toward the aisle. The plane's descent had come to an abrupt halt, but the situation was no less dangerous. Outside, the alien landscape stretched out in every direction, strange structures and towering ships blocking the view of any familiar horizon. His mind spun, trying to process everything that had happened in such a short time. The glowing towers, the incomprehensible voice, and now the shadow moving toward them, something was coming. And it wasn't friendly. He tried to steady himself, but the unnerving hum that had filled the cabin earlier began to increase in pitch, now vibrating through the very bones of the plane. It was no longer just sound, it felt like a force, like it was trying to manipulate the space around them. The woman beside him squeezed his hand tighter, her face pale and taut with fear. A soft voice suddenly broke through the tension, barely audible over the rumbling. "We're not supposed to be here." He turned sharply toward the source of the voice, one of the flight attendants, standing near the back of the plane. Her face was gaunt, her eyes wide and haunted, as though she had seen something no human should. She stepped forward slowly, her gaze flicking nervously toward the window. "We weren't supposed to land here," she repeated, her voice trembling. "None of us were. It's all a mistake. The flight, the diversion, it was all a setup. But now that we're here, we're caught." The man's mind raced. Setup? A diversion? None of it made sense. But one thing was clear, the people on this plane were no longer just passengers. They were part of something far bigger, something they hadn't been prepared for. His thoughts flashed to the mysterious voice on the intercom, the cryptic warnings, and the force pulling them toward this alien world. The question gnawed at him, what was it, what had brought them here? And why? "Do you know who they are?" he asked the flight attendant, his voice tight. "Who's coming for us?" Her gaze flicked nervously to the cockpit door, then back at him. "You won't understand until it's too late." Before he could press her further, the entire plane shuddered violently, as though it were being gripped by something immense from the outside. The humming intensified, and the lights flickered in a maddening rhythm. The shadow outside grew larger, blocking out the dim, alien sky. The ship, whatever it was closing in. A crash from the front of the plane suddenly pierced the chaos. The cockpit door had been forced open, and out stumbled the pilot, his uniform torn and disheveled. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "They're here," he gasped. "They're already inside. Get out now!" But before anyone could react, the lights in the cabin went out completely, plunging them into darkness. There was no time to think, no time to prepare. The man could hear frantic footsteps, passengers shouting, and the crash of objects being thrown about in the dark. Then, a sound unlike anything he had ever heard before, a low, guttural growl, like the sound of something far too large to be real. The temperature in the cabin dropped suddenly, a chilling breeze sweeping through the air, as if the very atmosphere was changing. The man's breath came out in visible puffs. "I told you it was a mistake to come here," the flight attendant whispered again, her voice barely audible in the blackness. "This was never just a flight. We were chosen, and now we have to face the consequences." The rumbling sound outside grew louder, vibrating the entire plane as though something enormous was hovering above them. The air was thick with tension, the waiting almost unbearable. The passengers held their breath, every second stretching on forever. They were trapped. And then, a sudden flash of light pierced the darkness. Not from the outside, but from within the plane itself. The light came from a strange, pulsating source at the back of the cabin. The man turned to look, and what he saw took his breath away. There, at the back of the plane, was a figure. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, with an angular body that seemed to shift and shimmer, as if its form couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. Its face was an unblinking mask of cold, alien intelligence. And in its hand was something that could only be described as a device, a small, glowing sphere, pulsing with energy. The woman beside him gasped. "It's them." The man didn't know what to say. He was frozen in place, unable to comprehend the full horror of the situation. This wasn't just a strange plane ride gone wrong. This was something far beyond human understanding. The alien figure stepped forward, its movements fluid and unnatural, as though gravity itself had little effect on it. Its eyes, or what might have been eyes, glowed with an unsettling intensity. It raised its hand, and the light from the device in its grasp pulsed, sending a wave of energy rippling through the cabin. The force was palpable, and for a moment, the entire plane shook violently as if it were being pulled apart. The man could hear the passengers' screams fading, becoming muffled as though they were no longer in the same space. And then, everything went quiet. The hum, the rumbling, the chaos, it all stopped. The only sound left was the man's own breath, ragged and shallow. Slowly, cautiously, he turned to look at the alien figure, still standing at the back of the plane, its form flickering like a glitch in reality. "Do not resist," it said, its voice not spoken aloud, but somehow felt inside his mind. The words weren't threatening, but the tone carried an unmistakable weight of finality. "You have already been chosen." The man's mind raced. Chosen for what? He glanced around at the terrified passengers, each one still frozen in place, eyes wide and unblinking. He understood now, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't just a plane going off course. They were part of something much larger, something beyond their control. And whatever was happening, whatever had brought them here, they were caught in its grip. Before he could ask another question, the alien's hand moved again, the device glowing brighter. A flash of blinding light filled the cabin. The plane shuddered one final time. And then, everything vanished. The man blinked. He was standing alone in a vast, empty void, with no plane, no passengers, no alien figure. It was as though the world had shifted, and they had all been transported to somewhere new. He reached out, his hands trembling, but there was nothing to touch. Only emptiness. And then, far off in the distance, something stirred, something immense, moving toward him. The final twist came not in the form of an attack or another immediate threat, but in the realization that the world they had known had been altered irrevocably. They hadn't just been transported to an alien land, they had been transported through time itself. The man's heart dropped. Whatever he had thought this was, whatever anyone had thought, was nothing compared to the truth. They were no longer on Earth. They were now somewhere in the distant past. And whatever they were about to face, it was coming, and it had no intention of letting them leave. And so, as the darkness closed in around him, the man realized the truth. The real nightmare was only just beginning. The man stood frozen in the vast emptiness, feeling the oppressive weight of the unknown closing in. He had no idea how they'd arrived here, how they'd crossed from one reality to another. The panic that had gripped the passengers in the cabin was now gone, replaced by a chilling silence. All around him, the world felt like a forgotten dream, a place where time had no meaning and no mercy. But there was something, or someone, approaching. He could sense it, like a dark force moving through the void. His breath quickened, his thoughts scattering. Where had the plane gone? Where were the others? Was anyone left? And what had the alien figure meant when it said, "You have already been chosen"? Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet shifted, and the space around him seemed to twist, revealing jagged edges of black stone stretching into the distance. The air grew thick, heavy with an unnatural energy, and the figure he had sensed earlier finally emerged from the shadows, walking toward him with an almost graceful certainty. The man's heart thudded in his chest. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. The figure wasn't just an alien. It was something more, something ancient. Its form rippled like water, a shimmering, translucent being that seemed both familiar and alien at the same time. It stopped in front of him, its eyes, or whatever they were, locked on his. You are here, the being said, its voice not a sound but a presence. It was as if the words were being whispered directly into his mind, a cold, distant sensation that sent shivers down his spine. Not by accident. Not by choice. But by destiny. The man's mind reeled. Destiny? But why us? Why were we chosen? The being tilted its head slightly, as though considering the question. You were not chosen for any particular reason. You were chosen because you were in the right place at the right time. And now, you must witness the truth. As the words reverberated in his mind, the ground beneath them seemed to ripple, and the space around him expanded. The dark void gave way to vast, rolling landscapes of a world he didn't recognize, surreal mountains that seemed to be made of liquid glass, sky towers reaching high into an impossibly bright sky, and strange creatures roaming the land below. This, the being said, gesturing toward the landscape, is where you have come. Not just across space, but through the very fabric of time. You are now in a place that exists outside of your history, a world before your world. A time before your time. The man's breath caught in his throat. This was impossible. Are you saying this place is older than Earth itself? The being nodded. Older than Earth. Older than the stars themselves. A moment before existence as you know it began. You were chosen to bear witness to the creation of what you call reality. To understand what came before. To know the beginning. His mind was spinning. This couldn't be real. He had seen the alien ships, the strange light. He had watched as the plane descended into a place that defied everything he had ever known. But this? A world before time itself? It was too much. And yet, the strange being's presence, its cold energy, left no room for doubt. The man shook his head, trying to make sense of it all. Why bring us here? Why now? The being seemed to pause for a moment, its form shimmering as if caught between dimensions. Because you have been prepared, though unknowingly. Everything that has happened to you, all the events that brought you to that plane, were not by chance. You were part of a larger design. A design that spans beyond the understanding of your kind. He stared at the being, trying to comprehend its words. What design? What do you mean? The being's form seemed to distort, becoming more solid for a moment. Your world is built on cycles, but those cycles are fragile. They must be watched over, guided. We have been the watchers, the ones who have shaped the course of existence. Your reality, your timeline, was never meant to be what it is now. A sense of dread washed over him. He wanted to ask more, but the weight of the being's words made it hard to form any more questions. His head was swimming, the meaning of its words washing over him in waves. Then, something shifted in the air. A distant rumble, like thunder, echoed through the atmosphere. The being's form flickered once more before it spoke again. You were chosen, it said, because your presence here is a key to the unraveling of the cycle. The man's heart raced. Unraveling? The being nodded. Yes. The timeline has become fractured. Your reality, your world, has been altered in ways you cannot yet understand. We have watched as humanity has strayed from its true path. And now, we must act. The landscape around them began to change again, faster now, flashing in a kaleidoscope of colors. The man's vision blurred as he tried to keep his focus. But all at once, everything became clear. The alien figure was no longer alone. Other figures appeared, standing in a line beside it, their forms just as shifting and strange as the first. They spoke in unison, their voices merging into one. You are the witness, they said. The key to the end and the beginning. You will choose whether to return to your world, to repair the fractures, or to allow the cycle to end. But be warned, the choice is yours, and it comes with great consequence. The man's breath caught. He wanted to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The world around him, this place before time, was alive with an energy he could not comprehend. And yet, at its core, there was something human about it. Something that made him feel like he was standing at the crossroads of a universe's fate. You have seen the truth, the being's voice echoed. Now, it is your decision. Choose wisely. The man felt a sudden, crushing weight on his chest, a realization settling over him. This wasn't just about surviving this strange world. This was about the future of his people. The future of all life. For a long moment, there was silence. The ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse, and he felt the weight of every decision he had ever made, every action that had led him here. Then, a calmness swept over him. He understood. With a deep breath, he stepped forward. I choose to go back, he said, his voice steady. I choose to repair the fractures. I choose to fight for my world. The alien being nodded, a flicker of what might have been approval crossing its face. The others stepped back, and the landscape began to fade once more. Then you shall return, it said softly. But know this, you are no longer the same. You are the witness. You are the keeper of the truth. And just as quickly as it had all begun, the man was back in the plane, surrounded by the chaos and confusion of the passengers. The alien figures, the vast landscape, the strange force pulling them through time, all of it was gone. But he would never forget. The story didn't end there. The fractures in the timeline had been mended, but the choices made in that strange place would ripple through time. What happened next wasn't just about his survival, it was about all of humanity's. He had chosen the truth, and the world would soon understand just how deep the cycle ran. And for those who had been part of the journey, there was only one thing left to do: find the strength to face what was coming.